Snow fell quietly over the northern kingdom of Valemore, covering the stone towers of the palace in soft white. Inside those walls lived a ruler feared by everyone who spoke his name. King Chaol Draven, the Alpha King, was known across the land for his strength, his cold eyes, and the silence that followed him wherever he walked. Soldiers lowered their heads when he passed. Servants avoided his gaze. Even his own generals chose their words carefully, afraid of saying the wrong thing. Chaol had not always been this way. Long ago, before the war that changed everything, he had laughed easily and trusted the people around him. But that was before his own brother betrayed him, before the night that left a deep scar across his chest, and before he lost the family he once loved. Since then, Chaol had built walls around his heart, just as thick as the palace walls that protected his kingdom. No one was allowed close. No one dared to try. Far from the palace, in a small village near the border, lived a young woman named Leora Ashwood. She was an Omega, the gentlest and rarest rank among her people. While Alphas were strong and commanding, Omegas were known for kindness, patience, and a deep gift for healing. Leora had spent her whole life learning how to care for others, first from her mother, then from the village healer who took her in after her parents passed away. When a sickness spread through the lower villages, healers were needed urgently in the capital. Leora was chosen to travel to the palace and assist in the royal infirmary. She had never seen a palace before, let alone the king himself. Stories about him frightened most people, but Leora did not feel afraid. She had learned long ago that fear rarely helped anyone heal. The palace was grand beyond anything Leora had imagined, with tall pillars and quiet hallways that echoed with careful footsteps. She kept to herself during her first days, working alongside the head healer, tending to soldiers and workers who came through with injuries. She noticed how everyone spoke about the king in hushed tones, always careful, always distant. She wondered what kind of man could inspire such deep fear in an entire kingdom. She found out sooner than she expected. One evening, word spread through the palace that the king had been injured during a battle near the eastern border. He returned pale and breathing hard, blood soaking through his tunic. The healers who first saw him grew pale themselves and refused to step closer, whispering about an old wound that had reopened, a scar from years ago that no one was permitted to touch. It was said that anyone who dared to lay a hand on that scar would face his fury. Leora did not know this rule. She only saw a man in pain. Without thinking twice, she stepped forward, pushing past the healers who stood frozen at the doorway. Chaol lay on the bed, his jaw tight, his eyes half closed. The wound across his chest had split open again, an old scar turned raw and red. Leora knelt beside him and pressed a clean cloth to the injury, her hands steady despite the tension in the room. "Someone stop her," one of the guards whispered, but no one moved. Chaol's eyes opened slowly. He expected pain, or perhaps another healer too afraid to do their job properly. Instead, he felt gentle hands working carefully over his skin, a touch so calm it startled him more than the wound itself. He looked at the young woman beside him, her face focused, her eyes free of fear. "You should not touch that," he said quietly, his voice rough. "You're bleeding," Leora replied simply. "I'm not here to be afraid of you. I'm here to help you." For a long moment, Chaol said nothing. No one had spoken to him that way in years. He let her finish, watching her every movement, surprised by how calm the room felt with her near him. When she finished bandaging the wound, she sat back and looked at him, waiting to see if he would be angry. He was not. "What is your name?" he asked instead. "Leora," she answered. "Leora Ashwood." He studied her for a moment longer, something unfamiliar stirring behind his tired eyes. "Thank you, Leora," he said, before closing his eyes again to rest. News of what happened spread quickly through the palace. Some whispered that the healer girl had been foolish, risking her life by touching the king's scar. Others said she was lucky to still be standing. Leora paid little attention to the rumors. She returned to her duties the next day, tending to the sick and injured as she always had. But Chaol could not stop thinking about her. Over the following weeks, he found small reasons to call her to his chambers. First it was to check on the wound's healing, then it became requests for tea, for company during long evenings, for conversations that slowly grew longer each time. Leora noticed the change but said nothing about it, simply continuing to treat him with the same steady kindness she gave everyone else. Slowly, Chaol began to open up. He told her about his brother, about the betrayal that had left him with more than just a physical scar. He spoke of the nights he spent alone after the war, learning that trust was a weakness a king could not afford. Leora listened without judgment, never flinching, never pulling away. "You're not afraid of me," Chaol said one evening, watching her arrange herbs on his table. "Should I be?" she asked. "Everyone else is." Leora considered this for a moment. "I think people are afraid of what they don't understand. They see your title before they see you. I only saw someone in pain that first night. That's all." Her words settled deep in his chest, deeper than any wound ever had. For the first time in years, Chaol felt something soften inside him, a warmth he thought had died with his brother's betrayal. Word of the king's growing attachment to the Omega healer did not stay quiet for long. His council grew uneasy, worried that an Omega held no proper place beside a king, especially one so unranked and unfamiliar with palace politics. Whispers turned into open concern during council meetings, though few dared to speak directly to Chaol about it. Among those most troubled was Lord Ashgrave, an alpha ruler from a neighboring territory, who had long hoped to strengthen his own influence over Valemore. He saw Chaol's newfound closeness with Leora not as happiness, but as an opportunity. A distracted king was a vulnerable one, and Ashgrave began quietly plotting ways to use this soft spot to his advantage. Meanwhile, Leora remained unaware of the growing tension around her. She continued her work in the infirmary, still visiting Chaol each evening, their conversations growing warmer, filled with quiet laughter that echoed strangely through the once silent halls. The guards outside his chambers began to notice a change in their king. He walked a little taller, he spoke a little softer. For the first time since his brother's betrayal, he seemed almost at peace. That peace was tested one night, during a royal feast, held to celebrate a temporary truce with a nearby pack. Nobles and generals gathered in the great hall, wine flowing freely, music filling the air. Leora had been invited to attend as a guest of honor, a gesture that raised more than a few eyebrows among the older nobility. Midway through the evening, chaos erupted. A hidden assassin, sent by Lord Ashgrave, emerged from the shadows near the head table, blade aimed directly at Chaol. Guards scrambled, but the assassin moved fast, faster than anyone expected. Without thinking, Chaol turned and pulled Leora behind him, shielding her with his own body as the blade came down, cutting across his side, instead of striking true. Guards quickly subdued the attacker, but not before the entire hall witnessed something they never expected. As Chaol turned to check on Leora, his tunic tore slightly at the collar, revealing a glimpse of the old scar he had hidden for years. The room fell silent. For the first time, the court saw not just their fearsome Alpha King, but a man who had suffered, who carried pain quietly beneath his armor, and who had just risked his life without hesitation to protect someone he cared for. Instead of weakening him in their eyes, it did something unexpected. It made him more real to them, more human, more like a king they could understand, rather than merely fear. Leora knelt beside him immediately, tending to the fresh wound with the same steady hands she always used. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "I would do it again," Chaol answered, his voice firm despite the pain. News of Lord Ashgrave's betrayal spread quickly once the assassin revealed who had sent him. Furious and humiliated, Ashgrave abandoned any pretense of peace and openly challenged Chaol's rule, claiming the king had grown weak, distracted by an Omega unworthy of royal attention. He gathered what allies he could and marched toward Valemore's borders, hoping to catch Chaol off guard. But Chaol was far from weak. If anything, the events of that night had reminded him exactly what he was fighting for. He rallied his generals, prepared his warriors, and stood at the front lines when Ashgrave's forces arrived days later. The battle that followed was fierce, testing every soldier's strength and courage. Leora refused to remain hidden away during the fighting. She set up a healing station near the back lines, treating wounded soldiers as they were carried in, her calm presence steadying nerves even amid chaos. At one point, she recognized a captured spy among Ashgrave's men, someone who had been feeding information about palace movements for weeks. Her sharp memory and quick thinking helped expose the full extent of Ashgrave's betrayal, turning the tide of loyalty even further in Chaol's favor. By the time the battle ended, Ashgrave's forces had scattered, defeated not just by strength, but by the unity of a kingdom that had rallied firmly behind its king. Chaol returned to the palace exhausted, but victorious, his soldiers cheering his name louder than they ever had before. That night, as the palace slowly settled back into quiet, Chaol found Leora in the infirmary, tending to the last of the wounded. He waited patiently until she finished, watching her work with the same quiet admiration he had felt since that very first night. "You could have stayed safe," he said softly. "So could you," she replied, smiling gently despite her exhaustion. Chaol stepped closer, taking her hand in his. "I want you beside me, Leora, not just as a healer, as my equal, as my mate." Leora's eyes widened, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. She found none, only sincerity and warmth she had grown to know so well. "Are you certain? The court, your people?" "They already know what I know," Chaol interrupted gently. "That strength isn't about hiding your scars. It's about letting someone see them and choosing to stand beside you anyway." Tears welled in Leora's eyes as she nodded, unable to find words strong enough to answer him properly. Instead, she reached up and gently touched the scar across his chest, just as she had that very first night. Only this time, not as a healer treating a wound, but as someone who loved him completely. Word of their bond spread quickly through the kingdom. What had once seemed impossible, an Omega standing beside the fearsome Alpha King, became a symbol of something the kingdom desperately needed after years of war and fear. People began to see that strength did not always look like cold silence and distant power. Sometimes it looked like gentleness. Sometimes it looked like courage to love, despite every reason to remain guarded. In the following months, Chaol ruled with a steadiness that surprised even his oldest advisors. He remained firm in matters of justice and protection, but there was a new warmth in how he treated his people, a patience that had not existed before Leora entered his life. The kingdom, once shadowed by fear, slowly began to heal alongside its king. Leora never stopped working as a healer, even as her role within the palace grew. She trained new apprentices, taught them not just the skills of medicine, but the importance of approaching every patient without fear, just as she had once done for a king everyone else refused to touch. Her example inspired a new generation of healers throughout Valemore, ones unafraid to step forward when others hesitated. Years later, people would still tell the story of the night an unranked Omega healer touched the Alpha King's scar without fear, changing the course of an entire kingdom. It became a tale parents shared with their children, a reminder that true strength often begins with a single act of courage, and that even the most guarded hearts can be reached by someone brave enough to try. Chaol and Leora ruled together for many years, their bond only growing stronger with time. He never forgot that first night in the infirmary, the moment her steady hands had done more than heal a wound. They had reached something deeper, something he thought had been lost forever. And every time she traced the old scar across his chest, he was reminded that some of the deepest wounds could still lead to the greatest healing, if only someone brave enough was willing to try.